Good afternoon. Welcome to Lunch with Books.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Before we get to our guest for today, I just have a few announcements. The first of which is to help our friends at the Blair Public Library, or the Blair Public Library in Ohio. They're the beginning of their Great Stone Viaduct series, which meets on Wednesdays at 6 p.m. Starts tomorrow with Dan Frizzy talking about Bob Hope in Bel Air. And they'll be also showing one of Hope's films on Thursday. But there's a brochure going around. I think our friend Gene was presenting one of these, and maybe a few other people you know, and a few you don't. So be sure to go to those programs, especially since they don't interfere with anything we're doing. So I'm happy to promote it. Now, if you have a cell phone, please turn it off. Thanks, by the way, for braving the winter conditions to be here today. Hopefully it's clearing up outside. It was supposed to by noon. Thursday, we will continue the Ancient History series with Greece Part 3. Our friend Laura Michelle Diener will be back to tell us about Alexander the Great and Hellenistic Egypt. And then we'll continue the following week with Rome. Next Tuesday, the 7th of February, John Eric Gillot, who is the archivist at the diocese and also a historian, will tell us about, he has a new book about John Brown and John Brown's raid. But this particular program will focus on Dangerfield Newby, who was at one point a resident of Bridgeport, Ohio, and then ended up in John Brown's raiding party. And so you'll hear all about Harper's Ferry and those events next Tuesday. Our guest today is John Suval, and he's here to tell us, did I say that correctly, John?
Yes.
Thank you. His new book from Oxford University Press called Dangerous Ground, Squatter, Statesmen, and the Antebellum Rupture of American Democracy. He's a historian of 19th century United States, specializing in Jacksonian political culture and the American West. And John earned his Ph.D. from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His website is johnsuval.com. Here he is, John Suval.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It is truly a pleasure to be here. My wife and I moved to West Virginia last fall, and it was a bit of a homecoming for me because my family on my mom's side has deep roots in the Mountain State. So it really is a pleasure to be here, and a special pleasure to be here at the Ohio County Public Library. One of the joys of this project, once the book was out, has been to interact with libraries and librarians. And from my initial communications with Sean Duffy, it was clear that you all have something very special here in Ohio County. We had only just started corresponding about my book and a possible event when one morning I turned on West Virginia Public Broadcasting down where we live in Hampshire County, and I heard Sean Duffy on the radio talking about some of his own research into Harry H. Jones, pioneering African-American attorney and civic leader here in Wheeling. And then I really understood that Sean wears a lot of hats, including historian. So it's great to interact with people like that and with institutions like this. And I certainly very much appreciate you all coming out on a somewhat snowy, cold day. So thank you for During this talk, you'll hear the names of political parties that may sound familiar. While the names, in some cases, are the same, the parties were quite different from the present-day iterations of those parties. In July 1857, amid the ongoing violence in Bleeding, Kansas, the Leavenworth Times newspaper ran a piece lampooning Territorial Governor Robert J. Walker. The inhabitants of Lawrence, a hotbed of Republican abolitionist scheming in the eyes of pro-slavery fire eaters, and even more centrist Democrats like Walker, were preparing to elect a municipal government and pass ordinances in defiance of territorial laws. Fearing these most alarming proceedings risked, quote, a renewal of civil war, Walker deployed a company of U.S. troops to squash the rebellion. When the soldiers arrived, they did not encounter scenes of revolutionary abandon, but rather a small town going about its business. They set up camp outside Lawrence, and Walker remained with them, prompting the Times newspaper to give a mock blow-by-blow account of the governor's campaign. Monday evening, Walker dispatched 792 dragoons to arrest an audacious youngster who was selling peanuts in violation of our beloved Constitution. Boy to be tried by court-martial for high treason. Wednesday evening, dog heard howling and company sent to arrest him. Dog escaped, and so on. The piece ends with a final dig, delivering news from elsewhere in the territory. We stopped the press to announce we understand 3 settlers have referred the matter of a disputed claim to a committee of squatters in violation of the Constitution of the United States. Such a high-handed and infamous usurpation of power would sever the Union into splinters if allowed to go unpunished and unrebuked, and we hope Governor Walker will march an army down there without delay, accompanying it himself to prevent bloodshed and serve the miserable fanatics and lawbreakers as he has served those at Lawrence. The anecdote portrays Walker as an overreactive buffoon out of touch with the realities of Western life and the dynamics stoking conflict in Kansas. The territory was, in fact, awash with squatters, that is, settlers who lacked legal title to the lands they claimed. It could hardly have been otherwise. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 had opened the floodgates to white settlement before Indian titles had been cleared or lands surveyed. With the federal presence lagging, settlers filled the void with time-honored frontier institutions like squatter associations. These associations, also called claim clubs, mimicked the core functions of the General Land Office, prescribing rules for claiming land and provisionally awarding titles. In its send-up of Walker, the Leavenworth Times underscored the ubiquity and vital functions of such groups. Incisive as it was, however, the article missed the mark in one very important respect. By the mid-1850s, squatters were no longer simply settlers without title, vying for land. Rather, they'd become foot soldiers on the front lines of clashes over slavery that were tearing Kansas and the nation asunder. Rival squatter associations served as proxies in a ground war to determine whether there was a place for the South's so-called peculiar institution in America's future. In this talk, I will trace how squatters came to occupy such a profoundly disruptive position in American political life. Following in their footsteps offers a unique vantage point on how the United States grew into a continent-spanning juggernaut and how those territorial gains fractured the body politic as the issues of land taking and slavery expansion became stubbornly intertwined. By the mid-1850s, Robert J. Walker and the Democrats who controlled the White House, Congress, and the territorial government in Kansas had every reason to fear squatters. After all, they had, over the course of the preceding 25 years, elevated these once remote frontier scufflaws into a fetish at the heart of their political clan, and vested them with real power, resulting in a destabilizing transfer of authority away from the national government to inhabitants of the West. In short, they had incubated and unleashed the forces that wreaked havoc in Bleeding, Kansas, and beyond in the lead up to the Civil War. Let's consider how that happened. Unlike previous generations of statesmen who maligned squatters as outlaws and sought to contain them, Jacksonian Democrats rose to dominance in the 1830s and 40s in part by celebrating these illegal settlers as pioneering yeoman farmers and helping them to secure their foothold on Western lands through preemption laws, heavy-handed Indian policies, and hawkish diplomacy. Once ensconced in the newly conquered territories of the West, these same squatters overwhelmingly supported the Democratic Party. Such were the dynamics of squatter democracy, a brand of politics that transformed the partisan landscape and actual map of North America. A marriage of interests between DC-based Democrats and settlers in the West, squatter democracy was an engine of constituency building and source of party unity that cut across classes and geographical regions. At its core was a quid pro quo, land for political support. But this brand of statecraft also embodied an approach to a political economy geared toward empowering white Americans to claim and develop the West while keeping the government's footprint small. Animating the movement was the premise that the continent contained spoils of plenty for white men of all sections and views on slavery, so long as they agreed to let sleeping dogs lie and not argue too stridently for their position. The heart and soul of this political brand was the squatter, boldly made over in speeches, editorials, and popular literature by Jacksonian Democrats from a disreputable intruder into a resourceful, patriotic pioneer. For opposition Whigs, meanwhile, the squatter symbolized everything they found rapacious, reckless, and uncouth about their rivals. In this image by Missouri painter and politician George Caleb Bingham, the squatter really is emblematic of the Whig critique. You see a couple of men sort of lounging lazily in the foreground, looking a shade mistrustful, while a woman in the background is doing the washing, doing all the work. And I sometimes, when I see my wife sitting here in the audience, I hope to myself that she's not looking at that and seeing a family portrait of some kind. Whig denunciations of squatters were a boon to squatter democracy, which thrived on an us versus them sense of grievance. By treating white squatters as the oppressed, disparaged, and downtrodden, Democrats fortified their ties with Western settlers and justified territorial conquests. Thus, as the nation expanded, the party's power grew. To observe squatter democracy in action, let's turn our attention to a gator-rich stretch of the Yallowbusha River in north-central Mississippi, where, in the fall of 1833, hundreds of men converged in search of land. With hundreds of thousands of fertile acres up for bid, the government auction at Chocamo, as the place was known, was one of the most eagerly anticipated in a decade that saw public land sales in the United States soar to new heights. Chocamo was part of the Choctaw Cession, more than 10 million acres in Mississippi and Alabama, much of it ideal for growing cotton. The Jackson administration had secured this bounty in the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek of 1830, brokered by the U.S. and Choctaw leaders against the will of most tribal members. In the first big test case of President Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policy, federal agents began expelling the Choctaws to lands west of the Mississippi. The General Land Office set up operations at Chocamo to prepare for the auction, giving rise to a temporary town that included a land office, tavern, and little else. When sales commenced in October, men massed around the land office where an auctioneer barked out the township and range coordinates of successive tracts and took bids. Many watched in dismay as rival companies of speculators dominated the proceedings, driving prices far above the government's baseline rate of $1.25 per acre. On the third morning, the sale took a dramatic turn. Pennsylvania-born Robert J. Walker of Natchez, the man who one day would become the bane of young peanut vendors and canines of Kansas, called for the crowd to gather around him in front of the tavern. The 32-year-old headed a powerful group of Mississippi speculators at Chocamo. He announced that companies of speculators from Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee that had openly competed in early bidding were now joining forces. Their aim in uniting in a single company was simple, he said: to protect the interests of squatters who stood to lose their land and improvements if forced to bid against well-capitalized speculators. Walker sketched out how the plan would work. The company from that point forward would do all the buying and transfer up to a quarter section, that is 160 acres, at cost to each squatter, who agreed to refrain from bidding himself. By eliminating competition, all parties would get land at or near the minimum government price. The company would then auction off to the highest bidder the thousands of acres it had purchased and not transferred to squatters, and divide the profits among its shareholders. The pitch worked. When sales resumed that afternoon, the fierce competition that had marked the first 2 days subsided. Alarming accounts of the collusion that allowed speculators to hijack the auction at Chocoma filtered back to Washington, prompting the chairman of the Senate Committee on Public Lands, a virulent anti-Jacksonian from Mississippi named George Poindexter, to launch an investigation, making the land sale at Chocoma one of the most scrutinized and politicized of the period. Thrust into the national spotlight, Walker, a skilled lawyer, wasted no time mounting a spirited defense. In a letter addressed to his fellow citizens, Walker did not deny that he and his associates had combined to buy land. He had, in fact, bought many, many thousands of acres, mostly as the bidder for the company, but also in a private capacity, thousands, somewhere close to maybe 70,000. But he maintained he agreed to join the unified company of speculators, not to profit personally, but to secure preemption rights for squatters who had been denied them. I found the immigrants surrounded by wife and children who, with him, looked forward to the public sales as the probable period which was to expel them from the little spot which they had selected and improved and throw them forth again into the wilderness without a roof to shelter or a home to protect them, he claimed. George Poindexter did not buy for a second Walker's explanation that benevolence had motivated him to lead the band of speculators. In March 1835, his committee issued a scathing report detailing their findings. The agents of the company undertook to dictate terms to the actual settlers and claimed to themselves great credit for having permitted each occupant to purchase a tract, not exceeding 1/4 section, they wrote. All who refused to enter into this arrangement, and there were but few, had no other alternative but to bid against the large capitalists. But the instant he submitted to the authority of the company, his improvements were secured to him at $1.25 per acre. For Poindexter, this was all highly illegal, representing no less than, quote, the greatest enormities to have occurred at any time in any land office of the United States. To be sure, a number of Chocoma attendees had grumbled about wealthy men taking almost entire control of the sale. But Poindexter's report failed to capture, perhaps, the most salient truth. By and large, the folks present were pleased with how things played out, given that nearly everyone got the land they wanted at the minimum price. In fact, these men had feted Walker with a public dinner at the close of the auction. More significantly, in a January 1836 vote, members of the Mississippi legislature propelled Walker into the very U.S. Senate seat held by George Poindexter. Representatives from the 16 new counties carved out of the Choctaw lands, including men who had acquired land directly from Walker on favorable terms, overwhelmingly supported the squatter-friendly speculator, securing his victory. The Chocoma sales and their aftermath demonstrated the potency of squatter democracy, how it delivered spoils for a wide cross-section of white men, elites and non-elites, slaveholders and non-slaveholders, who were willing to play along. You've heard me use the term preemption a couple of times in this talk. This policy forgave squatters their territorial trespasses and it enabled them to obtain title retroactively to U.S. public lands they had illegally occupied. Missouri U.S. Senator Thomas Hart Benton was the architect of the Democrats' land policies and helped secure passage of the first major preemption law, the Act of 1830, which granted squatters across the vast public domain the right to procure at $1.25 per acre up to 160 acres of public land they had settled and cultivated. Groundbreaking as it was, the law was limited in that it applied only to squatters who had already resided on their land and planted a crop on it in 1829. Still, its enactment stirred expectation. New waves of westward moving migrants, having found a suitable spot for settlement, pressed lawmakers to accord them the same privilege. The effect of preemption was to foster a settle first, legalize later mentality. This aggressive land-taking ethos by squatters, in turn, emboldened Democratic leaders to assert American sovereignty over larger and larger areas of the West. It is important to note that the day after the Preemption Act passed in May 1830, Democrats also succeeded in pushing through the Indian Removal Act. Together, preemption and Indian removal formed a one-two punch, catalyzing a new era of rapid, often violent westward growth. So the public domain, that is the public lands and the public land survey system, conditioned how much of the West was surveyed, sold, and settled. You'll see here the typical township where you have 36 1 square mile sections, often divided more into, this half section, quarter section is 160 acres. That was often the unit of sale, although it soon became sold in smaller units than that too. And just because this is the part of the world we're in right now, that's the 7 ranges just across the Ohio River from where we are now. That's where the very first public lands were surveyed, beginning in the 1780s. And that's right there. And of course, in the green, that's the Old Northwest. But this system, this grid, essentially is how public lands across from here all the way to the Pacific Ocean were surveyed and sold. And that grid is still very much apparent in the landscape. If you've ever flown over the Midwest or just in large parts of the country, this is what you see, and it dates back to our public land survey system. Preemption became the linchpin of squatter democracy, connecting statesmen and squatters in a common objective, extending the measure indefinitely with an eye toward making it permanent. In pressing the case, Democratic politicians, in tandem with settlers who flooded Congress with petitions, developed a lingua franca of stock phrases and arguments that rebranded squatters from violent intruders into virtuous improvers, congealing into the character of the intrepid white yeoman who displaced, quote, the prowling wolf and roaming savage and planted the flag of American civilization in the West while defending the nation's vulnerable borders. Accordingly, they deserve deference, not scorn. Whether from the Old Northwest or Old Southwest, again, what I showed you before, the Old Northwest being essentially what we think of as the Upper Midwest, and the Old Southwest being just south of there in the Mississippi Valley, down Mississippi, Alabama, in that region. So whether from the Old Northwest or Old Southwest, the squatter petitions and the pitches from politicians showed remarkable uniformity. And this is really important, that in the South and North, they're basically on the same page, as it enabled Northern and Southern Democrats to sing from the same hymnal, touting squatter-driven expansion without having to talk about slavery. Squatter advocacy became a rainmaker for the party of Jackson and a sharp point of distinction between them and Henry Clay's Whigs. Like squatters, Democratic politicians framed dynamics of settlement as a struggle of good versus evil. Their principal aim was to allow the righteous ones, actual settlers, to hold on to their lands and defend them from diabolical land speculators who engrossed the best lands with the sole aim of making a killing. Preemption, they argued, was better suited to achieve this goal than the system of public land auctions, which were frequently dominated by speculators. While dripping with moral drama, Democratic advocacy for squatters did in fact embody a theory of political economy. Jacksonians promoted swift conquest of the West while also favoring limited government involvement. Who better, in their view, to advance these aims than the hardy pioneers who, armed with little more than shotguns, a few household effects, and preemption rights, ventured into frontier regions, created farms and communities, constructed infrastructure, and protected the nation from invasion. Whigs, by contrast, favored methodical westward growth and decried militant expansion. Preemption became a vehicle for the rival parties to elaborate their diverging positions on Western development and appeal to their core constituencies. Because preemption statutes remained in effect for limited periods only, their enactment set in motion a recurring cycle. With one act set to expire, a fresh spate of petitions from frontier residents would pour into Congress and generate intense debates during which Democrats would champion the squatters' cause while leading Whigs lashed into them, usually for the law to pass. Whigs ultimately conceded they could not stop the prevailing politics of settlement. Did any gentleman seriously believe that preemption would not be reenacted and continue to be reenacted from year to year, so as, in fact, to be perpetual? Sighed Congressman Samuel Vinton, Whig of Ohio, during an 1834 debate. The squatters are favorites with some gentlemen in the House, and always will be. Certainly they were a favorite of our friend Robert J. Walker, who won faithful constituents at Shakopee. He would vigorously champion their interests as he ascended the heights of power, first as a senator, then as the kingmaker behind James K. Polk's presidency, as U.S. Treasury Secretary, and finally, territorial governor of Kansas. Indeed, he had barely been in office a month when in March 1836, he introduced a comprehensive land bill providing for renewed preemption rights. The freshman senator used the occasion to deliver a passionate defense of squatters, taking the opposition, Clay above all, to task for using the word pejoratively. Sir, he pronounced, our glorious Anglo-Saxon ancestry, the Pilgrims who landed on Plymouth Rock, the early settlers at Jamestown, were squatters. They settled this continent with less pretension to title than the settlers upon the public lands. Warming to the subject, he added that Christopher Columbus and Daniel Boone were also squatters. By referencing the country's hallowed origins with nods to the north and south, Walker was making the case that America had always been a nation of squatters and was great because of it. He then turned his focus closer to home, observing that many of his, quote, most enlightened constituents, the very lawmakers who sent him to the Senate, were squatters. Grouping elite slaveholding legislators into the category of squatter revealed just how capacious the term had become. Whigs found it more than a little hypocritical that the great champions of squatters were among the nation's most notorious speculators. But settlers in the West prized the passion of their defenders. A group of preemption-seeking squatters in northern Illinois wrote to Congress in 1837 expressing their feelings of surprise and regret at the harsh characterizations of squatters echoed from the walls of the Capitol. They saw it as their role to set the record straight and talk about their contributions to the country. Who are squatters, they wrote? We are your brethren, engaged in the quiet pursuits of agriculture and its kindred employments, and in a country which 3 years ago was little better than a desolate waste, are now to be seen comfortable dwellings surrounded by valuable improvements. Water power is being improved, and saw and grist mills are built or rising in every direction. Towns and villages are already springing up. The tract has been divided into counties by our state legislature, and we have magistrates who administer equitable laws. Despite rising frontier pique, Henry Clay and party could not refrain from maligning squatters. During preemption debates in 1838, Clay made inflammatory comments that would haunt him for years to come. Squatters were a lawless rabble, he charged. What right had they to the public domain more than any other description of plunderers to the goods they may seize upon? Senator John Tipton of Indiana registered shock. Does Mr. Clay not know that the immigrants from the old to the new states are in the constant habit of entering upon the best public land they can find, building cabins to shield their families from the pelting of the storm, and cultivating the soil with the expectation and intention of paying the government for the lands whenever they should be brought to market? Tipton pointed out that entire Indiana counties were populated exclusively by squatters, a point echoed by his colleagues from Illinois, Alabama, and beyond. Roused to combat by Clay's anti-squatter bombshells, Robert J. Walker dared the Kentuckian to lead the forces which are to drive from their homes and consume the dwellings of these hardy pioneers. Clay coolly countered, do we live in a country of laws or not? A squatter might as well stake a claim to the White House, he suggested. "Sir," Walker replied, "I never knew of but one squatter in the White House who could be truly called an intruder there, and that was the one who was placed there with the aid of the senator from Kentucky and against the will of the people." And of course, there he's referring to the election of 1824, in which Andrew Jackson won the most popular votes and the most electoral votes, but not a majority, throwing the election to the House of Representatives, which Henry Clay was Speaker of. Clay put his support behind John Quincy Adams, who then became president. Enough of his fellow representatives voted for Adams, so he became president. And Adams duly named Clay Secretary of State. This hereafter became known as the corrupt bargain, which Jacksonians made political hay out of, for years and years, including here in 1838 in this debate. It wasn't quite as simple as Walker portrayed it here, but we do have to give him credit. It was a pretty good zing. Anyway, the Preemption Act of 1838 passed by an overwhelming margin, proving once again that Clay's anti-squatter animus was a gift that kept giving. Squatter democracy carried the day on rhetorical and policy fronts. The squatter figure, once universally vilified, had become over the course of the 1830s the darling of a flourishing Democratic Party, and preemption increasingly was the law of the land. Recognizing its potency, Whigs appropriated the trappings of the pro-squatter brand during the presidential election of 1840, waltzing into the White House on a log cabin and hard cider platform, and helping to pass the landmark Preemption Act of 1841, which made preemption permanent. But Democrats reclaimed the lost ground in the election of 1844, promulgating a bellicose program of expansion spearheaded by squatters in Texas and Oregon. This policy of parallel expansion was key to maintaining Democrats' North-South coalition, promising to deliver a vast new domain of free territory and a vast new domain of slave territory. Pro-squatter expansionism undergirded the Democrats' ascendancy and conditioned the claiming of large swaths of the North American West. Conquest came at a high cost, though, and not only to non-white and non-American peoples dispossessed of their lands. And one of the things that my book does is shows that the pro-squatter turn that the Democrats enacted, and that was a big part of their program, faced pushback really at every turn, whether it was the Seminoles and Sacs, resisting with military force, the great force of the U.S. Army and the frontier militias, or the Cherokees, who famously waged a legal battle and won landmark Supreme Court cases, and really used all the powers of persuasion at their disposal, to the Potawatomis up in Michigan and Indiana. Leopold Pokagon was the chief of a band of Potawatomis in the St. Joseph River Valley of Michigan, and they were pressed relentlessly to cede their lands, but time and again, he found ways to get beyond the pressure and secured a settlement in southwestern Michigan, which actually is still today a center for the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians in that part of the world. So it's important to note, and readers will see, that the effort to open the floodgates of settlement to white Americans was resisted and certainly didn't succeed, and we still have a multiracial West. So the same squatter politics that yielded dividends for Democrats in the early years of party building and set the tone and tempo of territorial expansion grew increasingly precarious as the nation conquered immense new areas and tensions over slavery escalated. So this is, again, going back to the fact that Democratic pro-squatter politics not only resulted in lots of dispossession, which was resisted, but started to become a point of fracture for Democrats themselves, and that's where we're moving into now in the talk. The U.S.-Mexican War proved a step too far, laying bare the inner tensions of squatter democracy and forcing to the fore a thorny question. Were squatters genuine yeoman farmers or forerunners of slavery extension? Determined to draw a line in the sand, a group of lawmakers, including Democratic Congressman David Wilmot of Pennsylvania, in August 1846, attached a proviso to an appropriations bill stipulating that any territory conquered from Mexico must be free. Wilmot was no abolitionist, instead professing himself to be the defender of poor whites who might better their condition by claiming and developing Western lands. The proviso passed the House, but not the Senate. Nevertheless, it cast a shadow over nearly all congressional action related to the West, up to the crack-up of the Union a decade later. The proviso galvanized the incipient free soil movement, whose name adroitly encapsulated what would become its core agenda: Western lands, free from slavery and free of cost for poor whites. The Wilmot Proviso and advent of free soilism posed mortal threats to squatter democracy. Since its founding, the Democratic Party had managed to hold together a national coalition, in part by promoting a platform of squatter-led territorial conquest that brought spoils to North and South alike. The squatter yeoman was a figure they all could get behind, relegating slavery to the background and enabling the party and country to move on, to march on. But Wilmot's intervention made it impossible to gloss over the contentious slavery question. Politicians promoting aggressive expansion now had to choose sides. The Constitution gave Congress the authority, quote, to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. Of course, this pertained to the public lands, the public domain. The Constitution gave Congress the authority to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. But backed into a corner, Democratic chiefs called for settlers, not Congress, to decide the slavery question for themselves. Lewis Cass, senator from Michigan, gave expression to this doctrine of popular sovereignty in a widely published letter from December 1847. Leave it to the people who will be affected by this question to adjust it upon their own responsibility and in their own manner, he insisted, and we shall render another tribute to the original principles of our government and furnish another guarantee for its permanence and prosperity. By taking the onus off lawmakers and placing it on pioneering migrants, the doctrine offered Democrats space to keep hedging on slavery and hold together their national coalition. In effect, popular sovereignty punted the intensifying conflict over slavery from Washington to the West. Oregon was the first flashpoint. Settlers there had already adjusted the slavery question upon their own responsibility back in 1843, when they established a provisional government with a constitutional ban on slavery. This occurred with little fanfare, in part because the far-off domain was jointly held with Great Britain at the time and not formally part of the United States. The Oregon Compromise, signed 3 years later, gave the U.S. sole possession of the Oregon country south of the 49th parallel. Clamoring for a bill to accord them official territorial status, Oregonians now found themselves in the crosshairs of pro-slavery Democrats. What's that expression? A picture is worth 1,000 words, maybe more. John C. Calhoun led the charge to keep this immense slavery-averse region, that is Oregon, from entering the Union as a territory. He insisted that Southerners had a constitutional right to bring their human property into U.S. territories that he claimed belonged equally to all the states and their citizens. Permitting territorial inhabitants to subvert that right would overturn the constitutional order, making territories masters of the states. Popular sovereignty was reckless and patently absurd, he thundered in August 1848, given that the first half dozen of squatters would become the sovereigns with full dominion over the land. Such sentiments from a Southern Democrat were an ominous development for a party that had traditionally rallied behind the squatter. When Congressman Robert Barnwell Rhett, also of South Carolina, made similarly disparaging remarks about Western settlers, fellow Democrat Richard Broadhead of Pennsylvania shot back. "We are a nation of squatters, and it is squatters who by their industry and hardy enterprise made the country what it is." In reasserting the trope of squatters as nation-building pioneers, Broadhead sought to return them to their pride of place within the Democratic Party. But their political nature had fundamentally changed. No longer land-taking agents of U.S. expansion, the boots of manifest destiny, if you will, and a symbol of Democratic Party unity, squatters had become, in the view of many Southerners, the masters of slavery's fate. The fracturing state of squatter democracy came through loud and clear in an October 1848 humor piece in the St. Louis Reveille, penned by John S. Robb, celebrated author of a collection of stories titled Streaks of Squatter Life. The article appeared on the eve of the 1848 presidential election between Whig Mexican war hero Zachary Taylor, Democrat Lewis Cass, and former Democratic President Martin Van Buren, now heading the Free Soil ticket. So you have three parties more or less in contention. And to think of Martin Van Buren as the standard bearer for the Free Soil Party is quite remarkable when you consider that he was one of the architects of the Jacksonian Democratic Party, who less than 10 years earlier had been president, a Democratic president, and now he's heading the Free Soil ticket. So there's very good evidence of a party that's really splitting. So the article, so in this article, on the eve of the 1848 election, an artist named Sam Stockwell floated down the Mississippi making sketches. One rainy afternoon, he happened upon a squatter standing outside the cabin he shared with his wife, Betsy, and children. The conversation quickly turned to the upcoming vote. "Are you a Taylor man?" inquired Sam. "No, by thunder," said he. "Do you go in for Cass then?" "Well, I calculate not, stranger." "What? Do you support Van Buren?" continued the artist. "No, I support Betsy and the children, and it's damn tight screwing to get along with them with corn at only 25 cents a bushel." As the artist sped onward, he heard the squatter call out, "Hurrah for General Jackson, the old Mississippi, and me and Betsy." Amusing as it was intended to be, and sometimes it's hard to know if this mid-19th century humor really translates to today, but this passed as high humor back in the day. This parody of Jacksonian squatter democracy had a sobering message. As the 1848 election drew near, the squatter had come untethered from its traditional partisan moorings. Amid the uncertainty, the squatter character in the story wanted nothing more than to return to the glorious days of Jackson, when settlers knew who their friends in Washington were. This is another image from the Streaks of Squatter Life, which actually is also the cover image of my book. With Taylor's victory, Zachary Taylor's victory, California became the next major flashpoint of squatter politics and marked another key juncture where Democrats lost control of their signature brand. As politicians in Washington commenced a fierce protracted debate over the disposition of slavery in California, which sought entry into the Union as a free state, a self-styled squatter movement gained force in the Golden Land. Many had arrived in search of the precious metal, but were beguiled by the astonishingly fertile valleys they encountered and staked claims to choice plots. They quickly discovered that much of the terrain belonged to Mexican land grantees who, in theory, enjoyed property rights under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, by which the war with the U.S. was concluded. In the booming gold rush town of Sacramento, tensions between squatters and John Sutter, the Swiss immigrant who held a huge Mexican land grant, escalated into a full-blown turf war that reverberated nationally. Leaders of the squatter crusade, including Charles Robinson, who would go on to become Free State governor in Kansas, and who we'll meet again in just a moment. So leaders of the squatter crusade in Sacramento portrayed themselves as honest yeomen taking on the forces of power and privilege. But in a sign of the times, the Sacramento squatters tried to decouple squatter politics from partisanship altogether. Squatterism in a land like ours should be far above all parties, they proclaimed. Still, they tilted toward a free soil ideology and eventually formed an independent squatter political party, signaling that Democrats no longer had a monopoly on the squatter vote. A deadly squatter riot erupted in Sacramento on August 14, 1850, a day after the controversial bill for California statehood passed the Senate. Southern Democrats pointed to the violence as the latest example of squatter sovereignty run amok. One Georgia newspaper lamented that the California bill, quote, gives the vast area of territory lying between New Mexico and the Pacific Ocean to the free soil adventurers and squatters now depredating upon the public domain in those regions. In their view, every acre gained by squatters was another nail in slavery's coffin. As Jefferson Davis would later note, California gave the highest practical importance to the doctrine of squatter sovereignty. Its character was changed from speculative to real. For the previous quarter century, squatter democracy had harnessed the symbolic appeal and on-the-ground presence of white squatters for partisan gain and to advance an agenda of conquest. Oregon and California marked sites of fracture between Northern and Southern Democrats because, as popular sovereignty has emerged as the dominant mode to settle the slavery issue, it was becoming clearer and clearer that flesh and blood squatters, by and large, wanted nothing to do with the institution. In Oregon, the provisional government, with voter approval, had banned slavery in 1843 before Oregon was even a U.S. territory. In California, the Statehood Convention in the fall of 1849 had done something similar. Both bodies had exercised a form of popular sovereignty, to be sure, but organically and of their own accord, and not as a result of a policy prescription from Washington. In both cases, squatter-led settlement had naturally produced free soil societies, sparking Southern ire after the fact. Kansas was different. Stephen A. Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 recklessly repealed the Missouri Compromise, a measure that had kept peace for 30 years by clearly demarcating where slavery could and could not exist, and organized those territories expressly under the terms of popular sovereignty. Thus, with Kansas, all parties, squatters and statesmen, pro-slavery and anti-slavery, understood the ground rules from the get-go. Actual settlers, by dint of claiming land, would determine whether slavery or freedom would triumph. Having learned from hard experience that squatter sovereignty was all too real, in Jefferson Davis's phrase, pro-slavery partisans recognized it was no longer enough simply to denounce squatters and the doctrine that empowered them to determine slavery's future. So they made a bold play to claim the squatter for their side. In Kansas, pro-slavery and free state partisans alike self-identified as squatters and claimed other squatters as their natural constituents and allies. Such was the case with John Stringfellow, a Democrat in native Virginia, who used his Squatter Sovereign newspaper to advance both the pro-slavery and true squatter rights in Kansas, while strong-arming his way to the post of Speaker of the territorial legislature. So too with Charles Robinson, leader of the Sacramento squatter riot, who, following his stint in California, went to Kansas as agent for the New England Immigrant Aid Company and became leader of the Free State movement. A fascinating character. He was a Massachusetts doctor turned California gold prospector, leader of the squatter movement in Sacramento, and then the leader of the Free State movement in Kansas, and eventually the first governor of the state of Kansas. Robinson and his fellow Free Staters, who formed the majority in Kansas, by the way, rejected Stringfellow's brand of squatterism, which they considered a slave power ploy to turn Kansas into a slavery stronghold. In their eyes, these squatters were not genuine settlers, these so-called squatters were not genuine settlers, but whiskey-swilling, rifle-toting border ruffians who marched into Kansas from neighboring Missouri to harass Northerners and steal elections. For his part, Stringfellow viewed Robinson and associates as the true invaders, a pack of holier-than-thou New Englanders backed by rich abolitionists hell-bent on trampling slaveholders' rights. The two men did more than fight a war of words. Throughout 1855 and 1856, they faced off as leaders of dueling governments and at times as commanders of warring squatter armies. Much of the violence in bleeding Kansas began as land skirmishes, typically one squatter jumping the claim of another. Once commenced, these turf wars spiraled into larger battles between pro-slavery and free state factions, revealing how entangled the issues of land and slavery had become. Indeed, claiming land and determining slavery's fate were two sides of the same coin. Some squatter associations even wrote into their bylaws their stance on slavery, for or against, a novelty in squatter practice. Jumping a claim belonging to somebody on the other side of the ideological divide had the power to light a fuse, and often did. Democrats in Washington and the territory, including Territorial Governor Robert J. Walker, clung to their old playbook, urging squatters to move past slavery and focus their energies on the vast fields of opportunity that Kansas presented. Yet, rather than act as honest brokers and let the popular will prevail, Democratic leaders like Franklin Pierce and his successor James Buchanan, successive presidents Pierce and Buchanan, provoked a furious backlash within a faction of their own party and the country at large by throwing their support behind a pro-slavery minority, all too willing to cheat and pillage its way to victory. As a result, guerrilla warfare raged on in Kansas in a prelude to full-scale civil war, demonstrating how ungovernable the squatter sovereigns had become. Squatter democracy arose on promises of boundless opportunity for white male partisans and crashed because it sold greed as generosity, peddled violence as virtue, and, blinded by its own spin, failed to recognize the dangerous forces it had unleashed until it was too late. Rhetorically, the shape-shifting squatter yeoman could, for a time, advance the ambitions of white populations of the North and South. In reality, this mythic figure more closely matched the small family farmer than the slaveholding planter. Squatters could embody sovereignty, but not to the benefit of both free farmers and enslavers, nor to the exclusion of resilient, resourceful, non-white people across the continent. By the time men like Robert J. Walker acknowledged these truths, the party of Jackson lay broken in two, and the lands to which white Americans staked their sovereign claims had become battlegrounds. Little wonder Governor Walker would register panic when squatters in Kansas convened to settle a land dispute. Thank you. So we have room for some questions, little time for questions.
I have two questions.
Yeah.
When I think squatter,
Yeah.
I think poor white farming family
Yeah.
that just is looking for land.
Right.
Is that correct? Or were many of these new immigrants? Or
Yeah.
who were the squatters?
Right, and that's a good question because throughout this study, it was important to keep reminding the reader that there were, in fact, thousands and thousands of flesh and blood squatters who were staking claims in the West, who were clamoring for petition rights and being awarded those rights, and really being a force for territorial growth in the country. The Democrats realized that by celebrating this figure and removing barriers to settlement, they had a built-in constituency as the country kept expanding. the party that was favorable to settlers was going to naturally build constituents. What's curious, though, is when you start digging into at a granular level, like that Mississippi land sale, and you see that the term squatter is being used so capaciously. It's being used to some degree for small scale non-slave holding yeoman farmer families, but it's also being used by fairly sizable slaveholders and also by their politicians. So, you know, so by essentially calling for squatter-driven expansion and treating all squatters as one size fit all, they're all just yeoman farmers. So what's wrong with giving yeomen the West? They couldn't, in a sense, lose as they're saying, let's take Texas, let's acquire Oregon. It's only when the U.S.-Mexican War is such a vast chunk of territory, and for a variety of reasons, for things that had happened previously, a number of Northern Democrats are starting to ask themselves, wait, are we getting behind this whole agenda of conquest really to favor free family farmers, or is this somehow favoring, you know, the slave power? Is this going to result in vast new domains of slave territory and throw askew the balance of power in Washington? And that's when Northern Democrat David Wilmot draws his line in the sand and says any land acquired from Mexico has to be free territory. And he basically gets written out of the party and is persona non grata for a time, and becomes associated with the free soil movement, which is also saying let's have Western expansion, but all those lands should be for non-slaveholding whites, poor whites, and free of cost. So they're essentially calling the bluff. They're saying, yes, if you're really about championing the yeoman, well, if that's what we're all about, Democrats can't say, oh, we agree, let's leave the West for poor non-slaveholding whites, because they're a North-South coalition. And if they get on board with it, then that's why they make the fateful decision to say, we shouldn't decide this. Let's let the settlers themselves decide it. And that's when we start getting the, you know, scenes of guerrilla warfare in the West. So, yes, there were plenty of actual settlers, squatters in the West, but the term is being used so manipulated, so capaciously, and by the way, even people like Walker, who starts to become identified as the Mississippi squatter, even as he is one of the most avid speculators in the entire country, but by being really shameless and insistent that he is the squatter's, you know, guy in Congress, and keeps rhetorically celebrating them and saying, and legitimately pushing for preemption rights, which did favor small settlers. But for a long time, you couldn't lose as a Democrat by touting this line until things just got out too far ahead of the reality. If it had, you know, so there's a lot of spin, a lot of smoke involved with the pro-squatter pitch. Yes?
I just have a comment. After listening to this, politics haven't changed much. Spin it some more so we can get some votes or whatever.
Yeah, it's not the first time I've heard that comment, and I certainly was very aware of that. And, you know, that was one of the things that I found really fascinating about the project. It's sort of, be careful what you wish for. You can harness forces to your advantage up to a point, but if it's mixed in an appeal that favors a certain group, leaves out a lot, obscures inner tensions, those tensions are eventually going to boil over, and you're going to lose control of it. And Walker's a great example. You'll see in this book. You'll track Walker's career. He's so consistent, and even as he's, you know, becoming governor of Kansas in his inaugural address, he's basically using this very same phrases or very similar phrases to the ones he's using in the 1830s as he's becoming the squatter champion in the Senate. He kind of just, it's muscle memory. He thinks it's worked for so long, he almost can't pivot, but the Democrats had really created a situation that they had lost control of. And Walker, he actually starts to see himself as Hamlet. He starts, like to be or not to be. He pens this autobiography just as he's getting, as he was supposedly had the full back. Walker was a major figure. He's probably one of the most important figures that no one's ever heard of until like a study like this comes around and says, oh, this guy Robert J. Walker actually was very consequential, and he was in his day a major statesman. To the point where when James Buchanan begged him to become territorial governor in Kansas, Walker's in his mid-50s. He's basically an elder statesman. He's got a big house in Washington, D.C. He's investing in mines and railroads and land. The last thing he really needs to do is go to Kansas, which is already bleeding Kansas, which, has already had lots of bloodshed. But his hubris and the fact that Buchanan says to him, you're the only guy. The thing about Walker is that he was born in born in Pennsylvania, but made his career in Mississippi. So he was sort of somebody who people saw had an appeal across sections and was clearly the squatters, supposedly the squatters' best friend. So it seemed like a brilliant choice. But like other governors before him, he couldn't master the forces in Kansas, kind of watches it all just fall apart. And as he's basically resigns his position, he pens this autobiography trying to understand why he's the most hated person in America. And it was wonderful to encounter this autobiography among his papers in the Library of Congress, because his public speeches, the one defending himself from the land sale, a speech he gave promoting U.S. Annexation of Texas. His public letters actually were somewhat of a sensation. This Kansas autobiography never saw the light of day. It was kind of scrawled on scrap paper, like 80-something pages. He just seemed like someone who was unraveling. It was interesting to see him kind of have to lie in the bed he'd have to make. Yeah.
Is there any family connection between your Robert J. Walker and William Walker, I think it was, who was a soldier of fortune in Central America?
Yeah.
Tried to establish slave.
Right. And he actually made himself briefly president of Nicaragua. And in fact, in another sort of infamous Pierce administration move, the Pierce administration was willing to sort of treat them he was willing to treat him as a sovereign head of state, even though he was a freebooter. He was a soldier of fortune and really pro-slavery. No, there's not. But it is an interesting question, because when you're working in archives, so for example, in the James Buchanan papers at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, you'll see lots of letters to and from Walker, Robert J. Walker, and then you'll see something suddenly appear from William Walker, actually asking for some kind of clemency or pardon. Yet had good handwriting, better handwriting than Robert J. Walker.
He ended up against a wall, I think, down in Nicaragua.
Yeah, he did.
And they said, fire.
It did not end well for him. He was the so-called gray-eyed man of destiny. In fact, I mean, there was a real move among slaveholding states to look beyond the borders of the United States into the Caribbean and into Latin America as possible new domains for slave territory. So it's a good question. Yes, sir.
Two quick ones. Did this sink Henry Clay's chances for the presidency? And where does this fit in with the Hamilton and Jeffersonian traditions in the U.S.?
Yeah, so really good questions. And there is no doubt that Clay calling squatters a lawless rabble was, a drum the Democrats kept beating. In fact, it's really seen in the election of 1844, where they're circulating tracts at a mass scale called Henry Clay Against the Frontier Settlers, that cites chapter and verse all of these heresies. Again, Clay actually himself tried to circulate a letter via newspapers saying, I never said that. I did think, that squatters should, in an orderly way, acquire title prior to settling land. But the people themselves, I didn't hate the sinner. It was the sin that But it didn't, and there are plenty of scholars, and I am one of them, who believes that because the election of 1844 was extremely close, and there were a lot of factors that led Polk to, the dark horse James Polk, to ultimately triumph against a major statesman like Henry Clay. But the squatter thing was a cudgel that the Democrats used very effectively. And to your point about Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian, it's very much the case that the Jacksonians are heirs to a Jeffersonian lineage. Jefferson was all about, the idealized yeoman character, populating the continent from to the thousandth generation. But, and this is important, Jefferson was very much about orderly settlement. And even his successors, like James Madison, the Jeffersonians basically had the White House from 1800 to about 1824, when John Quincy Adams becomes president. So, and they're still trying to promote Western settlement, but also enforcing legal settlement. And they, in fact, Jefferson himself signs the Intruder Act, which basically authorizes military force against squatters who have taken land without title. And the Whigs very much descended from the Federalists. Hamiltonian's sort of view of the public lands as a source of speculative capital, of government revenue. So the Whigs really thought, we need to use these Western lands, the sales from these Western lands, to fund internal improvements, canals, roads, things like this. And we'll develop the West in a way where agriculture and industry kind of develop in tandem, and not just allow this scramble, which they basically saw. So preemption is throwing everything askew. People are just rushing out there, grabbing the best lands. So it's definitely, there are lineages there. But it is very important, and this is a key point, the Jacksonian pro-squatter turn is very novel, because none of the Jeffersonians were basically saying, let them have at it, let's just in mass remove native peoples, whenever a conflict arises, let's move in the soldiers. There's some of that. Now the Jacksonians constantly made the point that this was not novel. These kinds of dynamics were going on. And in a sense, they were right. Even the Jeffersonians, who did not want this scramble to the West, were not able to really stop it. The big thing, though, is that the Jacksonians thoroughly dispensed with the hand-wringing and basically said, why are we even calling this a bad thing? Look at these people go. Look at them go. They're claiming more land, securing us from, the depredations of Great Britain, France, any of other imperial rivals. They're building communities, and so it is very, very interesting to see these lineages. Now, one last point I'll make is that the Democrats tied themselves in such a knot over this pro-squatter, expansionism, that by the 1850 election, not only is the party split to the point where they're running two candidates, John Breckinridge, who was Buchanan's vice president of Kentucky, pro-slavery guy, is really the Southern favorite, and Stephen A. Douglas is the Northern candidate, and he actually starts carrying the badge of the Squatter King. Both the Southern Democrats and Lincoln are constantly, ridiculing him because he really cleaves to the doctrine of popular sovereignty, which is also known as squatter sovereignty. And even more emblematic of the changing times, the Homestead Act for free land actually passes in 1860, right in the sort of height of the election season in June of 1860. And James Buchanan, a Democratic president, vetoes the Homestead Act, which would have been the crowning achievement. Preemption was good, but they still had to pay for the land. Homestead is free land up to 160 acres. And a Democratic, so you really see how land and the figure of the squatter settler it has become truly an albatross around the neck of the Democratic Party. So, was there one more? Do you think we need to wrap up?
One more.
Okay.
One question. Preemption was basically legalizing what they call tomahawk rights.
Say more about how you understand tomahawk rights. You mean just laying them down just a spot on the
Coming
ground?
in and making your mark on trees.
Yeah.
Claiming the land.
Yeah.
This was just by act of Congress making it legalized.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, in a sense, people would often say that this preemption was affirming squatters' rights. But squatters' rights, as you suggest, typically, and this is where the squatter associations or claim clubs, they were sort of an extra legal form of creating order, and they would recognize, okay, this person has claimed this quarter section, they've built this improvement, this person has squatter rights. So whether it's marking a tree, building, some kind of, and in fact, the border ruffians I referred to, the Missourians, what really left the Free State side just aghast and frustrated was that Missourians would come in and build a very rough little dwelling. In fact, Horace Greeley even had an account of someone using a birdhouse to assert preemption rights. So yeah, so that's very much longstanding frontier practice, is to put some kind of mark to say this is my land. Okay, well, thank you all very much. It's been very nice to be here. Thank you. And we have books for sale if you're interested. So, and a good rate, by the way.